we are going to interview Herb Laube, one of the professors at Alfred Adler Graduate School. He's going to give us a little bit of his background and some concepts from Adlerian psychology, and hopefully some other interesting ideas for psychology. With that, I'll open up.
Okay, well, thanks, Laurel. I've been involved with the Adler Graduate School for the last 20 plus years, and started out by teaching a course in human sexuality as my initial sort of involvement here, and have continued to teach a variety of courses at the school. And I'm not sure how I became introduced to Alfred Adler. I guess it was through some readings in psychology when I was working on my master's program.
Was that in a regular college or a private college?
Actually, I was at United Theological Seminary, and we had a course in looking at contemporary counseling theories and some of the historical ones, and Alfred Adler and his approach was one that we reviewed in that course, which sort of tweaked my interest. And then I saw Dr. Dreikers do a family therapy demonstration program down in Bloomington High School somewhere along the line, and had a chance to see him before he died, but at least I could see his style of working, which intrigued me at the time.
Dreikers is one of the proteges of Adler?
Actually, Rudolf Dreikers was a psychiatrist who grew up in Austria. He ended up being in the military, I think in Austria for a while, ended up having to go to Argentina due to World War II, and eventually came to Chicago, and he is known for spreading the Adlerian ideas actually throughout the United States, Chicago, Oregon. He went to Israel, he was over in Europe. So he became kind of the more aggressive son adopted by Alfred Adler to spread the Adlerian ideas. Adler's own son, Kurt Adler, was very active in New York. He tended to be more focused in New York City after Alfred Adler and Risa, which is Adler's wife, moved there in 1937 or 35. I'm not exactly sure when they came to New York to escape, again, the World War II Nazi oppression. So Dreikers and Adler were probably the two main players during, Dreikers really was in the United States doing a lot of his work from about 1950 to 1970. Those were his most productive years, I believe, if I have my dates straight on that.
So there was some impact on your life from listening to Dreikers?
Actually, seeing Dreikers and seeing him do family education, which appealed to me. I actually come to the Adlerian psychology by family social science at the University of Minnesota, and I took courses in the psych department and in the family social science department, along with my theological background, and then psychology and family science, which are three kind of aspects of holistic thinking that are very compatible with some of Adler's thinking. So I really came into the social sciences not through medical science, which is how Adler kind of came to being Adler in some ways. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's interesting, you were asking me to come up with maybe some background things that caused me to be interested. I didn't realize at the time, but my own grandfather, who actually grew up, this was my father's father, grew up in Posen, Germany, which is also Posen, Poland. Mm. But he was born in 1870, the same year that Adler was born.
A coincidence.
There's a very interesting coincidence. He was in the German military, and then he came to the United States. This is my grandfather. Went back, brought my grandmother here, proceeded to have 9 children, of which my father was number 5. And then as I was growing up, I had a chance to learn how to begin my interest in family therapy, visiting all my cousins, aunts, and uncles, and making the rounds on Sunday evenings in a small German community down in northern Iowa. The other coincidence that's pretty fascinating is my grandfather was killed in a truck train accident in 1934, and Adler died with a heart attack over in Aberdeen, Scotland in 1937. So both males sort of lived during the same time period. And since I patterned my life after my grandfather in some ways more than my father, as being a migrant who moved north of Iowa, didn't certainly go halfway around the world, but did leave my family of origin place and established a life up here, that I kind of identify with this kind of migration pattern that both my grandfather and Alfred Adler achieved to some degree. But my interest then in practicing holistic psychotherapy and dealing with family systems is very similar to some of Adler's interest. So I kind of found myself intrigued by Adler's practical approach to the family, which kind of fits my sensibilities as well. And so anyway,
Are there some specific concepts or pieces of Adlerian psychology that come to mind when you think about those that you resonate with?
Yes. Well, initially the family councils intrigued me, and that was one of the things that I heard about early on as a way of trying to create sort of a fairness and equity between generations and kind of respect for individuals, and that the family to practice some kind of group decision making. So the family council idea, which Adler started back in Vienna when he and his students set up several clinics. They worked with several, I think, pediatric clinics, and actually did work with families and provided some free counseling to families during that time. Now, some of this was funded by the state of Vienna, or the state of Austria, or the city of Vienna. I'm not quite sure. But this notion then of Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which is social interest, having an ability to be concerned about the community and helping people fit into the community, and then function with some sense of commonwealthness, which is one of the ways we talk about that, or social welfare, which is another variation, I think, of the social interest idea. But the word Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which is kind of a German word, a little difficult to translate. So that particular concept, along with the technique of family councils, are a couple of the initial notions that I found very intriguing. The other thing that I like about the theory is it's very practical, it's very simple, it's straightforward, easy to understand. However, it's not so simple to make it all happen in a nice, balanced way. The life task idea, which...
What makes up the life task? That's there's 3 life tasks, or there's actually more, but 3 that came from Adler, and then there's been some added on.
Right. Well, actually, Freud started out talking about love and work were the 2 primary tasks of life. And given how obsessive Freud was about his own lifestyle, he didn't really have time for friendships because he was so obsessed with writing. Adler was social and interactive, and so he added 3, which was love, work, and friendship. And then the Chicago School, and this is where I think Dr. Mozak from the Chicago School, and maybe Dreikers had something to do with this, but came up with the task of self and development of the self as a task. And the 5th one is escaping me at the moment.
Spiritual?
Oh, the spiritual task, right.
That's the idea of holism and holistic, kind of the holistic view of Adlerian psychology. Maybe they're rounding it out or being more specific.
Yeah, the last 2, self-task and spiritual task, are much more controversial in the Adler, and among some of the Adlerians who are in the inner circle. I tend to stick with the basic three is
Mhm.
making the most sense to me, and so I haven't given as much credit to the 5-task notion. But I think it's a useful way to think about the individual. In the family systems world, the family systems people also break down that the family has some tasks to achieve as a family.
Mm.
So there have been the developmentalists talk about the family's tasks are having to do with teaching sexuality, helping with the socialization process, providing kind of home security and safety needs, and so they use a task model as well. So there's some interesting linkages there.
So really, did Adler ever have a family systems approach, or was his more specific to the individual?
Technically speaking, Adler really was a systems thinker for the individual, and his focus of study was not how the family system evolved, but how does the individual evolve over time. And as a child psychiatrist, he was very interested in encouraging the child. He certainly would look at how the family was woven into shaping the child. And so he's kind of a sort of internal systems approach to the individual and how the family is internalized into the child.
Oh, that's an interesting concept. Just so how one parents themselves, for example, and maybe what those messages are, or how that's performed.
Well, it's how the parents parent, but then how does the child internalize that? And I haven't heard Adlerians talk that way, but it strikes me as one of the ways that family engagement does occur.
Mm-hmm.
And then family councils was an attempt to kind of weave that together. Now Dreikers came along, and he sort of, as a European-born person, came here, and he was very cognizant of the socialization process in the United States. And since we're a democracy, he talked about 3 methods of child rearing, which was either the autocratic style, which he grew up with, and then the democratic style, which is kind of what American society supposedly translates into creating democratic citizens, and the family is an agent for that process. And then there's a laissez-faire style of doing child rearing, which is pretty loose. And so Dreikers, interestingly enough, was very autocratic in the way he taught democratic ideals. But he was really onto something in terms of helping families be more democratic in decision-making. So the family council was a way to help kids and parents interact around a kind of self-other respect.
So there's an equality in there. It's though all members of the family are equal, like all members of our society have equal rights, if you will.
Right. And he used that kind of equity theory that all persons are equal in kind of a fundamental, basic sense, that all human beings are actually, there should be some equity and fairness. That's the way creation was meant to be.
Mm.
And that the skewedness of that, where there's dominators and victims, is a kind of messing up the equation, if you will, the equalness, the equity. And so there's a kind of radicality about that, although it just presupposes that we are all human beings on the planet. We all have equal value as human beings. Now, we don't have equal talent, we don't have equal experiences and all that stuff, but nevertheless, that's the common denominator that should work at a global perspective.
So when you hear in Adlerian psychology the idea of it's not what you possess, but how you use it, I forget how they paraphrase that.
Psychology of use versus possession.
Mm-hmm.
That how you use what you have in order to be interactive and fair and so forth is more important than that you sort of have this psychology as some kind of possession. That it's not so much what you have. So you may have more talents than others, but then how do you use that for the sake of self, others, and the good of the community, that Gemeinschaft feel?
So the family represents a little small community, in a sense.
Well, it's kind of a microcosm of how the macrocosm could work. So it's a little socialization unit. And the more sophisticated it is, the more it equips people to live in a better world. Now, assuming everybody's operating on a similar frame of reference, it would be possible for everyone to live together more harmoniously than we many times have chosen to do. Theologians talk about creation was meant to be designed this way, that there's fairness and equity, and that all human beings are important, and that we all are here to help one another and be fruitful and multiply and take care of the earth and so forth. However, sinfulness has entered in, and so males have tended in the past to want to dominate. Women have then been denigrated to be under the domination motif, which is sinfulness creeping into the way creation was screwed up. And so to get back to this more, and it isn't so ideal, it's actually it's the real way it ought to be.
Now, Adlerian psychology is not one of pathologizing. In fact, wasn't Adler's mother kind of a feminist, or his wife, or there was some...
Well, Adler's wife and he met kind of in college, and I think it was the University of Vienna, and they were both pretty radical socialists at the time, and with her coming out of the Soviet Union, and Adler being kind of committed to his own concern about the well-being of the community, they sort of met on those grounds. And so she was pretty intense about some of her political values, and she actually grew up in a fairly wealthy family in Russia, so she came from a business family. And Adler himself came out of a business family as well, but his father was very connected to wholesale grain merchant or something in the suburbs of Vienna. So Adler was probably exposed to the farmers and the rural people as well as the sort of business class, but more linked to products of the earth, it seems like. So Adler was exposed to the working class a lot through his father's business. And then he met his wife, who was kind of, from what I gather, fairly down to earth, fairly successful business family, a little bit out of privilege, but didn't use that and didn't pursue that in her own life. So the two of them shared a kind of almost, I guess you could say, radical idealism. Not that they agreed on everything by any means. They were pretty intense. And their marriage wasn't exactly the happiest marriage in the world, but and they did almost separate a couple times, but apparently did not. But because she traveled a lot and she was busy traveling as well, so they were kind of probably an upper middle class family, professionally fairly able to travel a lot, but financially they lived a fairly moderate lifestyle. They were not pretentious at all.
So back to you. You're inspired by Dr. Dreikers. You get into family systems and see some wonderful parallels from Adlerian psychology into family systems. And then what happened?
Well, I think there's some natural tendencies to be able to understand Adler's ideas. He actually probably is a little farther out than what I am in terms of his meandering around with his ideas, but I also somehow naturally understand his thinking.
Is it intuitive?
Fairly intuitive. And I kind of see the bigger picture, but then I also tend to appreciate the practical dynamics of how you do family over time, which Adler seemed to do. What happened when I was in grad school, I started seeing some couples for relationship counseling, and it turned out that I was seeing a number of couples who happened to be members of the Adler board. And so they recommended to the president of the school that I was practicing Adlerian notions, even though I wasn't talking about it overtly. I was actually doing things the way Adler. And at that time I was looking for a place to belong, just like Adler said, and I couldn't find the right place because I was thinking I'd move to another university someday and I would teach at some university somewhere someday, and I couldn't figure out where it was. And I could go to these meetings and it just didn't seem to add up. And so then when I found the school and started reading even more intently about some Adlerian ideas, and I took the fundamentals classes here, and then I started going to the professional meetings, it was kind of that sense of belonging. But it was a discovery process. It was like, oh, here's where I fit. This is where I do have the sense of belonging. And oh yes, by the way, I do have some capabilities that fit in here, and I can also be competent. So I started to see that what Adler said made sense for what I was experiencing. So there was a meshing of many of his ideas along with some of my proclivities, and so all of a sudden there was focus in my life. So it was that kind of pathway. Well, other people find their way here somewhat similarly. That there seems to be a group of people that kind of naturally fall into this groove.
That sense of belonging is kind of an Adlerian concept. It's also a measure, of or a piece of social interest or community feeling, or a byproduct. I'm not really sure if you could speak to that a little.
Well, actually, if you look at which the business people know a lot about, this is the hierarchy of needs that Abraham Maslow made famous.
Now, is he an Adlerian distillation or?
Actually, quite a bit so, because Abraham Maslow and Adler met and spent time together in New York City when Adler came to the United States, and they had a Friday night group in New York, and Maslow and he were together, and Maslow picked up on Adler's ideas of understanding human nature, and then he just kind of categorized them in terms of physiological needs and psychological needs, and moving up this kind of hierarchy of needs based on understanding human nature, which Adler had written. And they actually had a big argument the night before Adler left for Scotland, and so they parted, unfortunately, when they were in the middle of a conflict. So, but Maslow is very much influenced by Adler's ideas and kind of went a little farther in mapping them out. So when you look at human nature at its core, there's a sense of how does the individual adapt to the environment, and where do you find your place, and where do you find your profession and your people and your connections in the universe. And where that match is, that's where you will have your sense of greatest belonging, and probably make your greatest contribution, because you and your talents match up with the world and its needs, and then you can give what you have to the world, and then it takes what you need to give, and it's receptive, and that's where you have a felt sense of belonging.
I think Mozak calls it the dance. There's a dance to it.
I haven't heard him say that, but that would make sense. That there's a kind of comfort and an easement and maybe a dance, but it isn't just an awkward dance, it's a comfortable dance with the place. And I suppose time and space and players would be more or less well connected for as long as you're dancing that part. Sometimes you sit down and do something different between dances.
Is there anything you'd like to in terms of core beliefs or private logic or any of those pieces, you could speak personally to it or, conceptually?
Well, core beliefs and core sensibilities wasn't exactly an Adlerian term. It's one that I think has been added to that. It's probably, we're talking about one's core nature or one's nature, and coreness is getting down to essence. And how do you do existentialism and your essence is part of what gives meaning to your existence and so forth. But yes, private logic was one of Adler's concepts, which is an important one. What he didn't say, which I think is interesting in its absence, is that there is also public logic. And so how do you link up private logic with public logic? Now we have we have personal approaches to life and we have public policies to life, which is probably equivalent in the larger world. But when you're dealing with families and you're dealing with kids, that we form our private logic, which contends with the kind of more family logic, and so you try to work out your private with the world of reasons and ideas of how it's supposed to be, and sometimes you make errors there. So there's some pretty interesting genius about that Adler was onto. And psychology still talks about that, and you get into talking about sort of the cognitive subsets that people have and how do you alter that. So it's been picked up on more recent psychology. So there's some very interesting concepts that have been adopted by traditional counseling psychology programs around the country. Sometimes they give Adler credit, sometimes not. The other thing about goals, being goal-directed, having purpose, which are interesting ideas that Adler, I don't think they were completely unique to him, but he put them together in a nice way.
You watch and see, by watching people, you can see what the purpose of their behavior is, or you watch what the purpose of their behavior is. As a therapist, what do you look for?
Well,
the goals of their behavior, maybe.
Again, this gets at some of the underlying structures that kind of guide and direct behavior, and so in some ways it's sort of the underlying purposes that may direct people's behavior. And so again, this gets at some of that private logic and mistaken ideas and beliefs that may confound the private logic. Again, it's very simple language, it's not too technical, it's fairly easy to understand, it's fairly easy to confuse too because of that. And so Adler again, in his kind of intuitive but very practical, somewhat simple way of being able to make clear sense out of sort of complex confusions, would help the person with their kind of core stuff, and help clarify that for people in terms of how it would be operative and the way that their behavior is operative. Treatment would then sometimes try to get at the underlying purpose of whatever that behavior is. So purpose can also be looked at in terms of what is a reason that you're here for, is your kind of overall number one priority in your life. And that I'm not sure that's Adlerian. I think that may be an extrapolation that has crept in around this thing in terms of a life purpose. Freud talked about it in terms of the pleasure principle versus the whatever the opposite of that is. So he got into kind of looking at the life force, but he talked about it more biologically and more sexually. And Adler kind of went into that, but he didn't talk about it in such a sexual way as he talked about it more in terms of behaviors and contributions and exerting power upon the...
Did they call that soft determinism? Is that there's some, as opposed to hard determinism, which is more Freudian, they are deterministic.
Right. Good question. Well, that gets a little bit into the philosophy where there is some of that we're kind of predestined and that we are sort of determined by our biology to do something or be whatever. But because he picked up on this existential phenomenological approach to how the self unfolds, and because we have freedom of choice, And because we can make changes, because we're influenced by outside things and inside things, that you try to help that process unfold. And so Adler would say that we're not determined by some outside force, we're not determined by society, but we are able to sort through this and determine our own circumstances within some limited range of choices that we've been given. And so things could go in a certain direction, however, they could go in other directions. And so everything isn't just fixed and you're on a path. As a matter of fact, you could go this way, but then it could go this way, and it could always be different because we have this kind of sort of process determinism, open to freedom in incidences, and so he was a little more tender-minded in his approach to things, and so he tended to say it could be this, it could be that, therefore you kind of move along and you don't try to impose certain things on people, but allow and facilitate this unfolding, if you will.
Anything can be different?
Right, therefore it can always be different, you have choices, we are freedom. Persons who have choices, we have to pay for our choices, we have consequences, and there are logical consequences, there are natural consequences, there are even, interestingly enough, and neither Dreikers or Adler used this, but there are social consequences to our choices. So that's one of the ways they extrapolate. Now some of this almost sounds like basic kind of Judeo-Christian values unfolding. But Adler stayed out of that because he didn't want to get into religious arguments and he didn't really want to get trapped in political arguments, so he tended to stay in the social science categories. And as he said, this could almost be a religion for people if they did anything better, but it wasn't designed to be a religion.
So, where are you now in your in your process? You're teaching a number of courses here. What are a few of those?
Well, I teach abnormal psychology, which does look at some of the deficits that people have, but can also look at how do you perpetuate self over time and how do you continue to unfold and become more of what you are, which family systems does allow me to do that, and I can bring in some Adlerian theories along with other theorists that come out of the family field. So I'm teaching a couple courses in that area. And then I teach case management, which gets at some of the more complex aspects of helping persons who need more help with not only the internal processes of psychotherapy, but they also need to be linked up to external resources in the community.
Is that similar to what a social worker does, or is it, how is that different?
It's kind of predicated on, there's official governmental caseworkers on county roles, but HMOs today have case managers too, and case management has become an in vogue sort of concept, and it's not really gone away. So it's kind of a special role of being a resource manager along with an external resource manager, as well as helping bring about internal psychological resources to help an individual unfold or develop or evolve or whatever you want to call that.
Move towards the positive.
Move towards the positive. Go from a felt minus to a felt plus, which is how Adler talked about it again in sort of simple language. Go from a felt minus to a felt plus, based on emotional sort of language. The other thing too is a link to this maybe is another set of concepts of having fictive goals that we live by guiding fictions. And so,
made up goals? I mean, they're pretend, or is that what we mean by fictive or fiction?
Well, they're kind of a choice we make towards achieving some state, and so then we set goals that are based on our dream, which is kind of a guiding fiction. It is not true in reality, but it is something we'd like to see happen.
Is it like ideals? Is it akin to ideals in that? sense?
Well, ideals are never achievable, where dreams are some ways a little off the edge, but goals are a way to start making real what is off the edge of ideals and dreams. And so fictive goals are fictions. They're not true, but they're true images of what you'd like to have. So they're almost like blueprints or something.
I see. You'd like your house to be built this way. You'd like your life to go and look something like this.
Right. Now, Stephen Covey talks about everything in the universe that happens is based on two creations. The first one is the blueprint, and the second one is the building of it. So, to live out some fictive goals is to, in some ways, create the blueprint of what you would like to see happen, and you can put it down, and then you start moving towards that, and then all of a sudden you can translate it into reality, which is the more tangible way that you create the thing that started out in a picture in your mind turns into a blueprint, which turns into reality.
So here you are at Alfred Adler Graduate School. In a way, that's a dream or an ideal for your a wonderful community of people and balance for you.
Yes. Well, it actually turned out to be, as I was kind of trying to find the graduate school of my dream world, thinking it could be a university somewhere. It ends up being the Alfred Adler Graduate School. It used to be an institute, then we have translated that into a graduate school as a name, but it's an evolving process. So it's a place to train practitioners. We don't necessarily train researchers here, but I'm more of a practitioner-based doctoral person myself. And in many ways, this has provided me with an academic community that's somewhat balanced between ideals and reals. And so it functions as a way to meet some of my needs to provide, supervision of our graduate students and training. And so I do like to teach, I do like to supervise, and I have had some experience in administration. And although my talents seem to be more in balancing ideals and reals, which is somewhere that I provided programmatic leadership, I think. Maybe is a fair way to talk about that. But yeah, that's a good question. I hadn't really thought about finding the dream here and kind of having probably done it, but not getting around to saying, oh yes, that did actually happen. The quest was there, it just took a little longer to find the place to belong, and then to participate and make contribution in some way, shape, or form.
Well, I want to thank you. If you have any, kind of last thoughts you'd like to share with the students, that would be fine. Any words of wisdom for them or encouragement? That's a big Adlerian concept. Please take the opportunity now.
Well, the one thing I'd pass along is I do have the privilege for the next 2 years of being the president of the Minnesota Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. And we've sort of adopted a motto for the Minnesota division of that professional group, and I think it fits right here in the Adler world, which is to help put sort of heads and hearts into homes. And as therapists in training, our goal is, and as academicians here, is to actually help families and parents and children alike to kind of get clear thinking, open up their hearts, and also then turn houses into homes. And so that's kind of our guiding motif. So the school here can participate in contributing practitioners who can help families achieve that. And so we've created a little logo that can fit into that. And Adler, because he talked about encouragement, which the key word in encouragement is kur, which means heart. So to have heart, to be able to not have fear, but to have courage, is to go into the present and the future with a sense of emotion and passion and movement, which is what Adler's thing is all about. So I think it's been fun here to help our students grasp that, become equipped to help families achieve that. And so anyway, that's the guiding motif that I would like to pass on, and I'm happy to be in the Adlerian community's company, offer my contribution, and maybe accelerate a little more competence in getting through those difficult places that we all face once in a while. So anyway, well, thank you for asking me to do this, and hopefully people will benefit from this and their journeys.
Thank you very much for your time.